An alien family ate at a restaurant and stayed overnight in a motel in suburban St. Louis in May 1970, according to ufologist John E. Schroeder, who interviewed employees and heard a strange and comic tale. Dorothy Simpson, a front desk clerk at the motel and a fellow member of the UFO study group of Greater St. Louis, tipped Schroeder off to the incident soon after its occurrence. Simpson was examining billing documents at her desk at 10:30 a.m. on May 15th when a whistling sigh sounded. She looked up, and on the other side of the desk stood 4 tiny people, apparently members of a family, a couple, and their 2 children. All looked strikingly alike. All were youthful in appearance, and the children were nearly the height of the ostensible parents. They were so short that they barely reached the level of the desk. They were all expensively dressed, the males in tailored suits, the females in pastel peach dresses. Their hair did not look real. Odd as it seemed, Simpson suspected that they were wearing wigs. In a falsetto voice, the man said, "Do you have a room to stay? Do you have a room to stay?" She told him what the charges would be, but he seemed not to understand what she had said. He turned to his female companion as if expecting her to clarify matters, but she remained silent. An uncomfortable period of silence followed, broken finally when the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of bills, many of large denomination. The bills were so crisp and new that Simpson wondered if they were counterfeit, but some quick informal testing suggested they were not. She took 2 $20 bills from the stack and gave the rest back. The man was too small to reach up and fill out the reservation form. Simpson said she would do it for him. He said his name was A. Bell. As she stepped forward, she got a better look at him and was able to compare his face with his companion's. According to Schroeder, whose composite description comes from his interviews with Simpson and other motel employees who saw them, they were wide at eye level, their faces thinned abruptly to their chins. Their eyes were large, dark, and slightly slanted. Their noses had practically no bridges, and 2 slits for nostrils, and their mouths were tiny and lipless, no wider than their nostrils. All looked uniformly pale. Color descriptions varied from pearl to pale pink to light gray. "And where are you from?" Simpson said. At that, the man's arm shot upward as if pointing to the sky, and he said, "We come from up there, up there." The woman pushed his arm down and spoke for the first time. She said they were from Hammond, Indiana, and she gave a street address. The man signed the register, but did it so awkwardly that Simpson thought he seemed not to know how to use a pen. The woman wanted to know where they could eat. Simpson indicated the direction of the motel restaurant. Meanwhile, the bellhop came over to store their bags while they ate. At the manager's insistence, Simpson checked the Indiana address and learned that both the name and the address were bogus. The bellhop checked the parking lot for a car with an Indiana license plate, but found none. The hostess, who led the strange family to a table in the restaurant, noticed that the chins of even the adults barely reached the top of the table. The man read aloud from the menu and kept asking odd questions about where milk, vegetables, and other common foods come from. The woman ordered peas and milk for herself and the children, and for the man peas, a small steak, and water. Their eating was similarly peculiar. Each picked up a single pea with a knife, brought it to his or her tiny mouth, and inhaled it with a sucking sound. The father was unable to get even a small piece of his steak through his slit of a mouth. They stopped eating all at the same time. The man produced a $20 bill and gave it to the waitress, who went to get change. When she returned, they were gone. When the bellhop saw them, he retrieved their baggage and stepped into the elevator to lead them to their room. When the elevator door opened, though, the family recoiled in fright and confusion. The bellhop had to assure them that there was no danger. After letting them into the room, he turned on the lights. Suddenly, the man began shouting at him that the light would hurt the children's eyes. Suddenly frightened himself, the bellhop fled without waiting, one suspects futilely, in any case, for a tip. The bellhop, the manager, and Simpson vowed to watch for the little people's departure in the morning, but they were never seen again, though the front door was the only door they could pass through without setting off a security alarm. The alarms were checked, and nothing was amiss. Schroeder interviewed all 5 employees who had interacted with the family. All seemed sincerely bewildered by the curious series of events. Trucker Harry Joe Turner allegedly met an alien named Alpha Zulu during a frightening encounter on a Virginia highway. The first incident reportedly took place on the night of August 28, 1979, when a UFO hovered over his truck. Even though the truck was moving at 70 miles per hour, an alien figure opened the door, and a terrified Turner fired several pistol shots at it, without apparent effect. Turner blacked out, returning to consciousness in the Fredericksburg warehouse that had been his destination. Turner noted other anomalies. His odometer indicated that he had traveled 17 miles, though he knew that Winchester, his starting point, and Fredericksburg were 80 miles apart. An odd, filmy substance covered his truck, and parts of his CB and AM/FM antenna were missing, as if they had been melted or cut off. He also complained of a burning sensation in his eyes. While trying to enter his truck to resume his journey, Turner passed out and was taken to a hospital. After a short stay, he was released and, on returning home, suddenly remembered that the UFO had lifted both him and the truck inside it. Turner also recalled that the craft carried a crew of white-clad, human-like beings who wore caps. When they took the caps off, Turner could see a series of numbers stamped or otherwise impressed on their heads. They spoke in a squeaky, high-pitched tone. Only when one of them, Alpha Zulu, slowed his speech could Turner understand it. As they traveled through space, Alpha Zulu and Turner asked Turner questions about his truck. Eventually they arrived at a planet 2.5 light years beyond Alpha Centauri, where dome-covered cities dotted an otherwise devastated landscape. Turner had the impression that the civilization had experienced a nuclear war in its not-distant past. Back on Earth, Turner later claimed other contacts with Alpha Zulu and assorted aliens. His erratic behavior, however, undercut his credibility, leading friends, family members, and onlookers to wonder about his psychological stability. Investigators also learned of Turner's reputation for yarn spinning. Heavy equipment operator Truman Buthram encountered the beautiful Aura Raines, captain of a spaceship from the idyllic planet Clarion on the other side of the moon, in the early morning hours of July 28, 1952, in the Nevada desert. When male crew members ushered him inside the craft, parked in an area known locally as Mormon Mesa, Buthram saw Aura Raines for the first time. She was small, had an olive complexion, and wore a black and red beret. The two engaged in an extended conversation during which they asked each other about their respective worlds. The spaceman spoke, Buthram would write, in a swinging, rhythmic tone of voice. When daylight came, Buthram was asked to leave, but they were to meet again. There were 11 meetings between July and November alone. Only on the occasion of the third meeting, on August 18th, did she reveal her name. Once he spotted her walking down a street in Las Vegas, but she refused to speak with him, apparently not wanting to be recognized. Buthram participated actively in the 1950s contact movement. Most outside observers believed him to be a hoaxer. His wife, Mary, apparently felt otherwise. She divorced him in 1956 on the ground that he was having sexual relations with Aura Raines. As with many other contactees from that period, it is impossible to judge just what Buthram believed or did not believe about his reported interactions with extraterrestrials. A privately kept scrapbook published after his death carried a poem titled Third Visit to Mormon Mesa, August 18, 1952, commemorating the meeting in which Aura Raines let him touch her to convince him of her physical reality. Other items in the scrapbook consist of clippings about himself and of materials lending support to his story. Though a skeptic of contact claims, British writer Hilary Evans remarks that we still have no yardstick whereby we can separate contactees into genuine and fake, and until we can establish some such criteria, we must provisionally extend the benefit of the doubt even to old poor Truman Bethram and cute little Aura Raines from the far side of the sun. Azealia is allegedly the half-extraterrestrial offspring of a Brazilian man and an alien being with whom he was forced to undergo sexual intercourse. Just after returning home from work around 3 a.m. on June 18, 1979, night watchman Antonio Carlos Vieira of Mirassol, São Paulo, was startled to see a UFO land outside his house. 3 humanoids entered and paralyzed him with red lights that emanated from boxes they carried on their chests. They and he floated into the craft, which eventually took off. Vieira passed out. Later, he vaguely recalled a mothership. Under hypnosis, his memories grew sharper, and he saw himself inside a mothership, looking at the distant Earth through a porthole. Approximately 12 different aliens, of 2 different but seemingly related types, occupied the same room. One group consisted of green-skinned humanoids with smooth dark hair, thin lips and noses, big eyes, and pointed ears. The others looked somewhat similar, except they had brown skin, thick lips, and red, crinkly hair. All stood 4 feet tall and were clad in white uniforms and gloves. A green being seemed to be in charge. Ferreira was taken into another room, which was dimly lit and made to lie on a couch. A naked female walked in and approached him as the other beings tried to remove his clothing over the abductee's resistance. The woman, about a foot taller than the others, was essentially human, with a larger than usual head, thin lips, chocolate skin, and narrow nose. Her breath was foul. Ferreira inferred that the beings wanted him to engage in sex with the woman, a notion he found repellent. Only after the humanoids subdued him with a sharp-smelling chemical were they able to disrobe him. Even then, he continued to fight until one of his arms was placed in a device and the other numbed with an injection. The beings spread an oily liquid all over him, and intercourse followed. At the conclusion of the act, oil was spread over him again, and they removed him from the apparatus and redressed him. The beings who addressed him via telepathy, but spoke an incomprehensible language to each other, explained that they had conducted an experiment. He would father a male child. At some point, after 3 unspecified signals had been given, they would return to show him his offspring. After giving him an unpleasant-tasting liquid to quell his appetite, they took him to the disc that had brought him to the mothership and flew him home. Ferreira suffered from a variety of small punctures and wounds, and for the next 20 days he had a burning sensation in his eyes. There were other incidents. In one, he was shown the child. In another, on board a UFO, he saw the child with its mother. On March 30th, 1983, one being came to his workplace to inform him, notwithstanding what they had told him earlier, that the child was a girl. Her name was Azealia. On April 23, 1897, a Kansas newspaper, the Yates Center Farmers Advocate, printed an affidavit attesting to an insistence of interplanetary calf wrestling. There were 3 witnesses, the most prominent of whom was Alex Hamilton, a rancher from Leroy, who soberly related the following. We were awakened by a noise among the cattle. Upon going to the door, I saw to my utter amazement that an airship was slowly descending upon my cow lot about 40 rods from the house. Calling my tenant, Gid Helsip, and my son Wall, we seized some axes and ran to the corral. Meanwhile, the ship had been gently descending until it was not more than 30 feet above the ground, and we came within 50 yards of it. It consisted of a great cigar-shaped portion, possibly 300 feet long, with a carriage underneath. The carriage was made of glass or some other transparent material. It was brightly lighted within, and everything was plainly visible. It was occupied by some of the strangest beings I ever saw. There were 2 men, a woman, and 3 children. They were jabbering together, but we could not understand a syllable they said. The occupants suddenly turned a searchlight on the trio, and the ship got closer to them. The witnesses then noticed a calf caught in the fence, with a cable fastened in a slip knot around her neck, one end passing up to the vessel and tangled in wire. They tried to cut the cable, but when they failed, they watched as it and the ship sailed away. The following day, a neighbor found the calves' butchered remains in a field where there was, Hamilton said, no track of any kind on the soft ground. Appended to the published account was a statement by some of the county's leading citizens who attested to Hamilton's truthfulness and good character. The story was published during a nationwide wave of sightings of mysterious airships. Some newspapers had speculated, seriously or otherwise, that extraterrestrial visitors were flying the ships. When Hamilton's story was rediscovered decades later, after UFOs had entered popular consciousness, it was widely published in the UFO literature, which cited it as an example of an early close encounter of the third kind. In 1976, however, writer Jerome Clark collected testimony from an elderly woman who had known the Hamilton family. She recalled hearing the elder Hamilton tell his wife that he and his friends from a local liars club, one of them the newspaper editor, had made up the story. Several years later, UFO historian Thomas E. Bullard came upon a letter Hamilton had written to a Missouri paper, the Atchison County Mail, cheerfully confessing that there was no truth to the story. Many years later, psychologist Susan Marie Powers studied the claims of a woman who claimed to have been abducted by extraterrestrials on a number of occasions. Once, while aboard a UFO, the occupants would lasso a cow, take it inside the craft, and extract blood from it. I watched as the blood went into a tube and then into a big tank, the woman reported. The cow's eyes would glaze over. Then I knew she was dead. We would fly back and drop her in the pasture with the other cows. The little people do not eat meat. They take the blood home with them. Another abductee, a Texas woman named Judy Doherty, related under hypnosis her alleged observation of a levitation of a calf into a UFO one night in 1973. The gray-skinned humanoid crew cut up the animal while still alive, apparently as part of its study of the effects of pollution on earthly creatures. Myrna Hansen told a similar story under hypnosis of an abduction in New Mexico in 1980, during which a calf was brought into a UFO and mutilated while still alive. According to ufologist Linda Moulton Howe, a rancher near Waco, Texas, came upon 2 greenish humanoids with almond eyes and big egg-shaped heads as they were carting away one of his calves. Terrified, he fled the scene. When he had recovered his nerve a couple of days later, he, his wife, and his son went to the scene. There they found, in Howe's words, a calf's hide pulled back over the skull and folded inside out on the ground. About a foot from the empty hide was a complete calf backbone without ribs. In July 1983, Ron and Paula Watson, a Missouri farm couple, spotted a landed UFO in a pasture. A bipedal lizard-type creature, known to ufologists as a reptoid, stood nearby. Through binoculars, the Watsons watched as 2 other beings, white-skinned humanoids in silver suits, ran their fingers over a black cow, which, though alive, was immobile as if paralyzed. Suddenly, the cow floated up the ramp into the UFO, which then, weirdly, seemed to fade into the hill, along with 3 aliens. In the UFO experience, J. Allen Hynek, a Northwestern University astronomer and former scientific consultant to the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book, proposed a classification system for UFO sightings, including 3 varieties of close encounters. The modern UFO phenomenon is 2 centuries old. In the early 19th century, the first reports of arguably UFO-like phenomena were recorded in scientific journals, newspaper accounts, and other sources, though such stories were relatively rare until late in the century, when alleged sightings of mysterious airships filled American newspapers between November 1896 and May 1897. Many were hoaxes, some concocted by the press itself. Among them were claims that the airships had landed, reflecting a widely held belief that an indigenous American inventor had built the ships and that the occupants were human. Some reports even gave the inventor a name, Wilson. Other accounts, however, described grotesque aliens, sometimes thought to be from Mars. Hoax probably is too strong a word to characterize these tall tales, which were apparently meant as jokes to amuse a readership that was not fooled. After 1947, the year flying saucers and unidentified flying objects entered popular consciousness, a number of seemingly sincere individuals came forward to speak of encounters they had experienced in earlier years, some reaching as far back as 1893, when a man in the Australian state of New South Wales told a newspaper that he had seen a saucer-shaped structure land on his farm. When he went to investigate, an oddly dressed man stepped out of the craft holding a device that resembled a torch. He aimed the device at the witness, who saw a light shoot out from it and hit his hand. He was knocked unconscious. When he awoke, the object and occupant were gone. For the rest of his life, he claimed, his hand was paralyzed. New Zealand newspapers of 1909 recorded a local airship sighting wave, including an incident in which a witness saw 3 figures in a craft passing overhead. One shouted at him in an unfamiliar language. In the United States, early on the morning of February 29, 1916, according to a report in the Superior Telegram, that same day, workers along Lake Superior Dock in Wisconsin saw a big machine 50 feet wide and 100 feet long, fly by at a high rate of speed about 600 feet in the air. Workers said they had seen 3 men inside the craft. This is the first known, seemingly credible, CE3 to be published at the time of its occurrence. CE3 refers to close encounters of the third kind. A newspaper referred to these mysterious craft by the name flying saucers for the first time on June 26, 1947, 2 days after private pilot Kenneth Arnold saw 9 discs maneuvering over the Cascade Mountains. This report account ushered in the UFO age. The same afternoon as Arnold's sighting, Oregon farmer Bill Shunning claimed to have seen a spherical object hovering 5 or 6 feet above a field. Just beneath it were 2 little guys in green suits with white helmets. They were no more than 3 feet tall. A few seconds later, they vanished. Schwooning did not see them enter the craft, which then flew off toward the Cascades. In the early UFO era, however, such reports, relatively rare but hardly non-existent, received little attention. In 1950, when the first book with flying saucers in its title, Donald E. Kehoe's paperback, The Flying Saucers Are Real, saw print, the occupants of the vehicles, Kehoe believed them to be peaceful extraterrestrials who deliberately refrained from contact, could only be speculated about. Another book being published that same year, Frank Scully's Behind the Flying Saucers, asserted that the U.S. government had recovered crashed spacecraft containing the bodies of little men dressed in the style of the 1890s and believed to be from Venus. Subsequent investigations determined that 2 veteran confidence artists had concocted these tales in order to peddle bogus oil detection devices tied to advanced extraterrestrial technology. Scully's notorious book had the effect of leading some early ufologists, as opposed to the Saucerians who embraced the contactee movement, to shy away from any reports of humanoids, whatever the source. A significant proportion of the reports described the occupants as humanoids. The specific descriptions may have varied, but witnesses mostly testified that UFO occupants had 2 arms, 2 legs, and generally human-like head and facial features. Usually the beings were small. Sometimes they were grotesque-looking. Sometimes they looked like small humans. A minority were of normal human height, and a few were said to be more than that, 7 or 8 feet tall. Such reports came from all over the world, including remote third-world locations where UFOs were little known, and the occupants were sometimes taken to be American or Russian pilots. A wave of humanoid and other encounters in France in the fall of 1954 received international attention and caused even the most cautious UFO researchers to reconsider their bias against CE-3 reports. In the summer of 1955, the Air Force's Project Blue Book investigated a bizarre episode in which members of a rural Kentucky family claimed to have spent a night besieged by floating, big-eared humanoid entities from a UFO. Close encounters of the third kind were different from the contact claims of George Adamski, Howard Menger, George Van Tussle, and other 1950s contactees in some important ways. For one, the beings seldom looked much like golden-haired angelic spacemen and spacewomen who figured in the contactees' tales. For another, they had little if anything to say. Communication, if any, and there seldom was brief, sometimes enigmatic, and always devoid of inspirational content. Unlike contactees, CE-3 witnesses fit the profile of witnesses to less exotic UFO phenomena. In other words, they were ordinary citizens without a background in occultism and other esoteric pursuits, as contactees tended to be. They also did not embark on lecture tours or write books, as the more flamboyant contactees did. A spectacular close encounter of the third kind took place over Baiono, Papua New Guinea, in late 1959. The best-known witness, the Reverend William Booth Gill, was an Anglican missionary from Australia. On the evening of June 26, 38 persons observed a large disc-shaped craft with 4 legs hovering in the northwestern sky. Gill estimated its apparent size to be that of 5 full moons, lined up end to end. At the top of the UFO, behind a glass-covered cockpit, 4 human-like figures surrounded by illumination moved back and forth, apparently working at an unknown task. The object and its crew ascended into gathering clouds after 45 minutes. Other UFOs, though not their occupants, were intermittently visible over the next 3.5 hours. 25 of the witnesses signed a statement attesting to what they had seen that night. At 6 p.m. the next day, the original UFO and its crew returned. At one point during the observation, Gill and others waved to the occupants, who waved back. The object showed up for the last time the next night, though no beings were visible. Interviewed in 1973 by J. Allen Hynek, native witnesses stuck by the story. Gill, who left the country in September 1959, stands by the report even today. It remains among the most impressive and puzzling of CE-3s. Far stranger and much harder to believe was the testimony of a young Brazilian, Antonio Villas-Boas. Villas-Boas came to the attention of ufologists in November 1957, when he wrote a letter to a journalist who had written about UFOs. Soon afterward, the journalist, João Martins, brought Villas-Boas to Rio de Janeiro, where he and physician/ufologist Olavo T. Fontes of the National School of Medicine of Brazil interviewed and examined him. The young man claimed that in the early morning hours of October 16, occupants of a UFO took him into the ship and left him alone in a room. A naked, essentially human-looking woman soon joined him there, eventually engaging with him in 2 sex acts. Before leaving, she made a gesture that led Villas-Boas to believe she would bear his child on another world. Martins and Fontes judged Villas-Boas to be sane and sincere. His intelligence and refusal to speculate on the incident made a positive impression. In spite of this, Fontes wrote, the very substance of his story becomes the heaviest argument against it. In 1962, 2 representatives of a Brazilian UFO group went to Villas-Boas's village to speak with him. Though desiring no publicity, he spoke, if reluctantly, about the experience. The investigators published an account of the interview in an English-language version of their bulletin, but it attracted little notice. Fontes's 1958 report circulated privately among a few English-speaking ufologists, but because of its sexual nature, no one would publish it. For most ufologists, the Villas-Boas episode was only a vague rumor, if that, until England's widely read Flying Saucer Review carried a series of articles on it, beginning in its January-February 1965 issue. The Villas-Boas case anticipated an escalation of the strangeness quotient of the CE3 phenomenon. On April 18, 1961, Joe Simonton of rural Eagle River, Wisconsin, was eating lunch when, so he would assert, a flying saucer landed on his driveway. He went outside just as a hatchway opened. A short, dark-featured man, dressed in a black two-piece suit and wearing a tight-fitting cap on his head, held a jug. From his gestures, Simonton inferred what he wanted the jug to be filled with water. He complied. As he handed the filled jug back to the man, he glanced inside the ship and saw 2 other men. One was sitting in front of a flameless grill, cooking something. When Simonton asked if they were eating, the man with the jug handed him 4 fresh pancakes, and then the flying saucer departed. Simon took a bite of one of the pancakes. It tasted like cardboard, he thought. The story of the Eagle River pancakes attracted national attention and a torrent of ridicule. Even UFO groups disagreed on its significance, some championing Simonton as a naive, sincere witness to an extraordinary event, while the Conservative Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena sneeringly dismissed the story as an absurd contact claim. Even Project Blue Book got drawn into the case, sending Dr. Hynek to the site to interview Simonton and local people. Few of Simonton's friends and acquaintances deemed him a hoaxer, or even a man with sufficient imagination to make up such an outlandish tale. Still, laboratory analysis found nothing out of the ordinary in the pancake sample it examined. In common with just about everybody else who looked closely at the claim, the Air Force ended up confused, stating at one point that Simonton was a balanced person of good mental health, and at another that he suffered a hallucination followed with delusion. Separately, a lone witness and a nearby farm family reported seeing a UFO over Simonton's residence, in the first case at the time of the supposed landing, in the second the next evening. Cases such as Villas-Boas's and Simonton's suggested a degree of communication between witnesses and UFO beings. To some ufologists, many never very enthusiastic about CE3s to start with, that suggested the despised contactees, even if neither man acted much like one. These ufologists were more comfortable with a CE3 report from Socorro, New Mexico, on April 24, 1964, from Lonnie Zamora, a police officer of undisputed reliability. Around 6 p.m., Zamora spotted a small, egg-shaped UFO resting in an isolated area on the city's outskirts. Close to the object were 2 small figures dressed in white coveralls, apparently examining the craft. On seeing Zamora, they ran behind the craft and disappeared. The flame-spewing UFO departed with a roar. Police, Project Blue Book, and civilian investigators found burn marks and impressions at the site. Despite its hostility to UFOs and its tendency to reach for sometimes far-fetched, conventional explanations for reports, Project Blue Book declared the case an unknown. It has since become a classic UFO incident, often cited by those who argue for the anomalous nature of the phenomenon. If Zamora's experience seemed relatively straightforward, Gary Wilcox's claimed encounter of the same day and a few hours earlier appeared as bizarre as Villas-Boas's and Simonton's, though not much like either in any other context. Wilcox, a young Newark Valley, New York dairy farmer, asserted that he had spoken with two short, spacesuit-clad UFO occupants for 2 hours. They said that they were part of a Martian expedition, Wilcox said, engaged in Earth exploration. Wilcox's story did not come to light until a few days later, since he had sought no publicity and discussed it only with friends and family members, who eventually leaked it to the local press. Like Simonton, Wilcox had an unimpeachable reputation among locals, and psychological testing revealed no abnormalities. Wilcox made no subsequent attempt to exploit his story. Though his testimony made no sense, even in 1964 scientists had abandoned the hope of an inhabited Mars. Wilcox seemed neither crazy nor dishonest. As comparable claims came to the fore, some ufologists speculated that UFO occupants were lying to hide their true identity and purpose. At the extreme, this led theorists such as John A. Keel and Jacques Vallée to move beyond ufology's venerable extraterrestrial hypothesis, or ETH, and into quasi-demonological speculation about earthbound elementals and other occult entities. As if to compound the confusion, by the mid-1960s, ufologists were confronting a new level of confrontation and contact between humans and UFO beings. In 1965, under hypnosis conducted by a Boston psychiatrist, a New Hampshire couple, Barney and Betty Hill, turned a consciously recalled CE3, an observation of figures aboard a hovering UFO one night in September 1961, into an onboard experience, including medical examination by gray-skinned aliens and conversation with the ship's captain. All of this took place during a 2-hour period of which the Hills had no conscious memory and for which they had never been able to account. To them, it had always been a puzzling period of seemingly inexplicable amnesia. Missing time, hypnotic regressions, great aliens, and medical examinations would play large roles in the emerging abduction phenomenon. In time, such abduction reports, the subject of a separate entry, would overwhelm CE3s as historically understood. Non-abduction CE3s would diminish in number and, in time, slow to a trickle, though they would not entirely disappear. One particularly well-documented incident reportedly occurred in the early morning hours of January 12, 1975, when 72-year-old George Obarski was driving home past New York City's North Hudson Park. He observed a glowing pancake-shaped object hovering above the park ground. A door opened, a ladder emerged, and about 10 small figures, dressed in one-piece suits and helmets, climbed down to collect soil and grass samples, which they scooped up with, quote, little shovels. An extensive investigation by 3 New York-based ufologists uncovered a body of apparent confirming testimony from an assortment of witnesses. In the most remarkable CE3 of the 1990s, a large group of children at aerial school Rua, Zimbabwe, while on recess on the morning of September 16, 1994, reportedly observed the landing of a UFO just beyond the playground. They saw 1 or 2 occupants, small figures, slightly more than 3 feet tall, with large slanted eyes and long black hair. They were wearing tight black suits. Though teachers were alerted while the incident was in progress, none believed the children and refused to go outside. Later, they changed their minds as the children produced remarkably uniform accounts and drawings. A British Broadcasting Corporation journalist, accompanied by Zimbabwe ufologist Cynthia Hind, interviewed the witnesses within a few days of the incident. Contactees are people who claim a regular, ongoing relationship with benevolent extraterrestrials, sometimes called space brothers. These aliens, essentially angels in spacesuits, are nearly always human in appearance, except better looking than humans are. They espouse an occult philosophy with recognizably terrestrial origins, notably in theosophy. Contact occurs in a variety of fashions. Much, perhaps most, of it is through channeling. Other psychic communications are effected through automatic writing, dreams, visions, or astral, aka out-of-body, travel. A third group, the most controversial, alleges physical contacts, including trips in flying saucers to other worlds. Physical contactees frequently offer evidence of their experiences in the form of artifacts or photographs. Persons who follow contactees and embrace their message are sometimes called, quote, saucerians. The contactee movement overlaps to a degree with the UFO movement, ufology, but the two differ in fundamental ways. To saucerians, there are no unidentified flying objects. Flying saucers' nature, origin, and purpose are known. They are here to educate humans to their larger cosmic destiny, to prepare them for the coming Earth changes generated by nuclear war, geological upheavals, polar shifts, or combinations thereof. To ufologists, UFOs are unknowns, probably of extraordinary unknown origin, but fundamentally a phenomenon that will eventually yield its secrets to science via conventional investigative and analytic procedures. Another way to express the difference is to see Saucerianism as a kind of popular religious movement, ufology as a popular, if often naive, attempt at scientific inquiry. Traditionally, ufologists have functioned as the contactee movement's fiercest critics. The contactee movement envisions a densely populated cosmos with hosts of advanced, wise space people linked in a kind of celestial United Nations, usually called the Galactic Federation or something like it. A minority of evil extraterrestrials opposes the Federation's benevolent mission. Both sides have representatives on Earth, individuals who pass as normal Earthlings, but who are in fact aliens. Many were placed here generations ago and have lived on this planet through many incarnations, patiently waiting to be activated when the time of transition, which will include mass landings of spaceships, comes. There were contactees before there were flying saucers. Perhaps the first of them was the Swedish scientist and mystic Emanuel Swedenborg. In Earths in the Solar World, written 1758, Swedenborg wrote of his astral travels to the moon and other planets. Each of these worlds, Swedenborg asserted, is inhabited, and he described at length the people and civilizations there. In the 19th century, with the rise of the spiritualist movement, psychic communications with extraterrestrials, most often Martians, were recorded on occasion. The most famous such case became the subject of a pioneering book in the emerging discipline of abnormal psychology. Theodore Flournoy's From India to Planet Mars, written 1899. In various states of altered consciousness, a woman given the pseudonym Helene Smith interacted with persons from the Red Planet, which she also visited astrally. She produced a Martian language that Flournoy identified as an infantile travesty of French. Reflecting a belief popularized by American astronomer Percival Lowell, Smith/Muller saw canals on the Martian surface. Her story, like those of Swedenborg and the contactees of the saucer era, mirrored astronomical and other scientific theories of the period. Within a few years, the notion of a Martian canal system would be thoroughly debunked. In the late 1940s and into the 1950s, it was still vaguely possible. Some astronomers thought that some neighboring planets, most likely Mars and Venus, could harbor intelligent life. Perhaps not surprisingly, the aliens in contact lore often hailed from our immediate vicinity. After space probes in the 1960s established, beyond further rational discussion, that beyond Earth there are no planets hospitable to life in this system, the extraterrestrials in contact claims were placed farther out in the cosmos. Either that, or the Venus, Mars, Saturn, and other solar planets said to harbor advanced civilizations became etheric counterparts, existing on a higher vibratory rate and distinct from the lifeless worlds we know. Another influential early book was Oafsby, wrote in 1882, the product of automatic writing at the guidance of angels, or so New York occultist John Fallow Newbrough asserted. Written between January and December 1881, the book is a mystical account of the cosmos, its history, and its inhabitants. The book stayed in print for decades and was widely read in contactee circles, where Ashars, guardian angels who fly spirit ships, became extraterrestrials in spacecraft. Indeed, the ubiquitous starship commander and channeling entity Ashtar may owe his name and occupation to Newbrough's creation. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who founded Theosophy, wrote of a hierarchy of, quote, ascended masters, including the Venus-based, quote, Lords of the Flame. In the 1930s, the flamboyant, fascist-oriented Guy Warren Ballard marketed a simplified, popular version of Blavatsky's doctrine. He spoke of his own meeting with 12 Venusian masters in the Teton Mountains in Wyoming. Religious studies scholar J. Gordon Melton identifies Ballard, who died in 1939, and his I Am movement as crucial to the development of the later contactee movement. Not only did Ballard become the first to actually build a religion on contact with extraterrestrials, he writes, but his emphasis was placed upon frequent contact with the masters from whom he received regular messages to the followers of the world contactee movement. The movement took over the I Am spiritual hierarchy and changed it into a space command hierarchy. In The Book of the Damned, written in 1919, the first volume ever written on the subject that would eventually be called ufology, Charles Fort speculated that strange lights and constructions observed in the sky and space during the previous century would be evidence of visitation from other worlds. He also advanced the possibly tongue-in-cheek speculation that, perhaps, some human beings were secretly in contact with the occupants of such vehicles. The first explicit contact in the context of a UFO sighting occurred on the evening of October 9, 1946, over San Diego. Many residents hadn't got outside in anticipation of a predicted meteor shower. Among them was medium Mark Probert, who channeled cosmic philosophy from a group of discarnates, including a 500,000-year-old Tibetan named Yada Deshait. He worked with occult theorist N. Mead Lane, who the year before had founded Borderland Sciences Research Associates. Probert and many others witnessed something that, whatever else it may or may have not been, was not a meteor. Observers would describe it as resembling a huge, bullet-shaped object with bat-like wings and a searchlight that had occasionally swept over the ground. Dark, except for 2 red lights along its side, it stayed in view for an hour and a half, moving at both slow and fast speeds. During the sighting, Probert phoned Lane, who urged him to see if the craft's occupants were interested in a telepathic exchange. According to Probert, the experiment succeeded. The crew members revealed themselves as peaceful people with lightweight, illuminated bodies. They had been trying to contact Earthling for many years, and though they were afraid to land openly, they would meet with scientists in some isolated area or on a mountaintop. They had mastered anti-gravity, and their ship was called the Carita. The San Diego Union carried a humorous piece on the sighting, including Probert's assertions in its October 18 issue. The UFO age began the next year with private pilot Kenneth Arnold's June 24 sighting of 9 shiny objects that the press would soon call flying saucers. In the wake of Arnold's report, many other people came forward to recount their own encounters with unknown aerial phenomena. Among the most outlandish claims to see print was one told by Old J. Snide. In a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, appearing in the July 3rd issue, Snide stated that the flying discs, also known as flying saucers, were spaceships from other planet. This is one of the very earliest public attempts to link the new public sensation with extraterrestrial visitors. Nearly all other speculation held the saucers to be natural phenomena or advanced terrestrial aircraft. The association of flying saucers as spaceships did not make widespread hold until the early to mid-1950s. Snide also said the saucers had a base on the dark side of the moon. He knew as much because he regularly teleported himself around the galaxy. A follow-up article in the Chronicle determined that Snide, a student of occultism, was serious. Though nothing more is known about Snide, he may have been something of a contactee before the word and concept had come into currency. The contact movement, however, did not emerge until cultural visibility until January 1952, when aircraft mechanic George W. Van Tassel began holding open weekly meetings in the high desert country of Southern California. At these gatherings, Van Tassel would channel messages from starship commanders, introducing, among others, the destined to be ubiquitous Ashtar. That same year, Van Tassel published I Rode a Flying Saucer, the first modern contactee book. Albeit with a misleading title, it would not be until the next year that Van Tassel would claim his first physical contact and spaceship boarding. The year 1952 saw a flurry of contact activity. In Prescott, Arizona, George Hunt Williamson, his wife Betty, and companions were communicating with Martians, Uranians, and other extraterrestrials from the solar system via Ouija board, radio, and mental telepathy. In July, in the Nevada desert, Truman Bethram met the crew of a scow from the planet Clarion, invisible to earthly eyes because it is always on the opposite side of the sun from Earth. Though arguably Van Tassel was the most influential of the first generation of contactees, the most famous was George Adamski. Adamski had a long history in California, going back to the 1930s, as a kind of minor guru. When flying saucers rose to prominence in the late 1940s, Adamski produced photographs of spaceships in the atmosphere and near the moon. On November 20th, 1952, accompanied by 6 associates, including George Hunt Williamson, he went out into the desert to meet a landed saucer and its pilot, a blonde-haired, angelic figure who Adamski would call Orthon. Adamski went on to write books, lecture all over the world, and become the single most controversial saucer personality of the 1950s. Though despised by conservative ufologists who charged that his accounts of meetings with Venusians, Martians, and Saturnians amounted to bad science fiction, he was also widely revered. In August 1953, more than 10,000 persons attended the Interplanetary Spacecraft Convention at Van Tassel's residence in Giant Rock, California. The speakers were mostly the new contactee stars. The movement was growing rapidly, becoming a worldwide phenomenon. It also produced a small library of books and newsletters. Over the course of the next few years, other contactees rose to occult celebrity. Many were physical contactees, but in time, channelers and automatic writers, most of whom did not seek publicity or profit, dominated the ranks. Not everyone was willing to take the space people at their word. Channeling contactee Trevor James Constable warned that some of them were demons in disguise. Some years later, occult-oriented ufologist John A. Keel wrote, quote, "The demons, devils, and false angels were recognized as liars and plunderers by early man. These same impostors now appear as long-haired Venusians." Christian fundamentalist authors of UFO books expressed similar suspicions. Adamski's death in April 1965 marked the passing era of the physical contactees. Even so, the most successful contactee of later years was himself a physical contactee, Edward Muir, a rural Swiss man with a background in the esoteric. Like Adamski and his first-generation counterparts, Meyer put forth photographs, artifacts, and allegedly confirmatory testimony to back up his stories of in-the-flesh meetings with space people and of rides in their spacecraft. Muir's extraterrestrials are from the Pleiades star system, but like Adamski's Venusians, they are handsome and beautiful with blonde hair and a generally northern European appearance. Unlike Adamski's and just about everybody else's space people, the Muirs have a specifically anti-religious message. The Pleiadians, according to Muir, believe only in the laws of nature. It also is safe to say that unlike other contactees, Muir, a keen businessman, has reaped a significant and continuing financial reward from his supposed experiences. He has also been at the receiving end of criticism and debunking efforts. After divorcing him, his ex-wife told investigators that his claims are without factual basis. In the United States, a major force in the movement has been the annual Rocky Mountain Conference on UFO Investigation, which has taken up where the Giant Rock Conventions, last held in 1977, left off. Started in 1980 by R. Leo Sprinkle, a psychologist and counselor at the University of Wyoming, it meets once a year, usually in the summer, and attracts contactees from all over, though most are from ranches, farms, and small towns of the Great Plains, underscoring the folk or ground-level nature of the movement. Contactees are different from abductees, whose experience became known only in the 1960s and did not become a major part of UFO controversy until the 1980s in several ways. A principal difference is that abductees tend to fit the profile of ordinary citizens, in other words, people without a background in occultism. In that way, they are also like most witnesses to UFOs. Abductees also report being taken against their will, and many consider the experience traumatic. Most do not claim to have attained superior wisdom from the experience, and most assert that their communications with their captors were devoid of messages of cosmic uplift. Yet in time, contactee-oriented writers and investigators began to see abductions as contacts by other means. Some abductees come to accept their experiences as painful but necessary learning experiences. Harvard University psychiatrist John E. Mack, whose study of abduction reports has convinced him that the aliens have benevolent intentions, has stated, quote, "If in fact the alien beings are closer to the divine source than human beings generally seem to be, their presence among us, however cruel and traumatic in some instances, may be part of a larger process that is bringing us back to God."